My dears, are you happy?
Oh, yes, Papa.
We are, my love.
Then I am content.
1902 studio photo recovered and historians are speechless as they enhance the image. The photograph arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Society in a worn leather portfolio, donated by an estate sale coordinator who had found it tucked inside a crumbling Victorian desk. The portfolio itself was unremarkable brown, cracked at the edges with brass clasps tarnished by time. But when archivist David Morrison carefully opened it and saw the studio portrait inside, something made him pause. The image showed a well-dressed couple standing in a photographer's studio, the kind of formal portrait common in Boston at the turn of the century. The man wore a dark suit with a high collar, his mustache carefully groomed, one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a young girl who stood between them. The woman beside him wore an elaborate dress with lace trim, her expression serene, almost too serene. The child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, stared directly at the camera with wide, solemn eyes. David had seen thousands of photographs from this era. Most told simple stories, families documenting their existence, their prosperity, their place in society. But something about this one felt different. The studio backdrop showed painted columns and draped fabric, standard for 1902, and the photographer's mark was embossed in the corner. J.P. Whitmore Studio, Boston, Mass. He placed the photograph under the magnifying lamp on his desk, adjusting the light to examine the details more closely. The couple's clothing suggested wealth. The fabric looked expensive, the tailoring precise. But as David studied the image, his trained eye began catching inconsistencies. The woman's posture seemed rigid, almost performative. The man's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And the child, there was something about the way she held herself, a tension in her small frame that seemed unusual for a typical family portrait. David made a note to research the Whitmore Studio archives. Perhaps there would be records, a sitting book with names and dates. He photographed the portrait with his digital camera, making sure to capture every detail, then carefully returned the original to its acid-free protective sleeve. As he uploaded the image to his computer, preparing to enhance and catalog it, David felt that familiar tingle of curiosity that had drawn him to archival work in the first place. Every photograph was a window into the past, but some windows revealed more than others. This one, he suspected, might have a story worth uncovering. He didn't know yet just how right he was, or how deeply that story would shake everything historians thought they understood about this seemingly ordinary family portrait. 3 days later, David sat in the digital restoration lab with Emma Chen, the Society's imaging specialist. Emma had worked with historical photographs for 15 years, coaxing details from faded daguerreotypes and damaged tintypes that seemed beyond recovery. She approached each image like a forensic investigator, revealing layers of information invisible to the naked eye. "This one's in remarkably good condition," Emma said, adjusting her glasses as the high-resolution scan appeared on her monitor. The studio used quality materials. The gelatin silver print has held up well. David pulled a chair beside her. "I want to see everything. The clothing, the jewelry, the studio props, anything that might help us identify these people." Emma's fingers moved across her keyboard, applying filters and adjustments. The image sharpened, contrast increased, shadows lifted to reveal hidden details. She zoomed into the woman's hands, folded carefully at her waist. The lace of her dress became crisp, individual threads visible. Then she moved to the jewelry. "Look at this," Emma said, her voice suddenly tense. On the child's chest, barely visible in the original print, hung a small, oval locket on a delicate chain. Emma enhanced the area, sharpening the focus until the locket's surface came into view. There was an engraving initials ornately scripted into the gold surface. "Can you read that?" David leaned closer. Emma increased the magnification further, applied another sharpening filter. The letters became clear. "M-E-R," David repeated, pulling out his notebook. Not initials that match any standard naming convention for 1902 Boston families I'm familiar with. But Emma was already moving to another area of the photograph. She zoomed into the background, where the studio's painted backdrop showed classical columns. Behind the columns, barely perceptible, was a small table with what looked like the photographer's props of vase. Some books, decorative items meant to be pulled into portraits as needed. "David, look at this!" Emma's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. She enhanced a section of the table, and suddenly an object came into sharp focus, a small framed photograph, turned at an angle as if someone had been examining it and set it down carelessly. The frame was ornate, silver perhaps, and inside it was another portrait, a woman holding an infant, the image clearly older, more faded. Why would there be another family portrait in the background of this one? Emma asked. David's mind was racing. Unless it wasn't meant to be there. Unless the photographer didn't notice it, or someone wanted it there, Emma finished. As evidence, they stared at the screen in silence. David spent the next morning in the Society's newspaper archive, a climate-controlled room filled with digitized records from every major Boston publication dating back to the 1780s. He started with 1902, searching for any mention of missing children, unusual family circumstances, or incidents involving the Whitmore studio. The Boston Globe's social pages from that year were filled with the usual announcements: weddings, births, society gatherings, charitable events. The transcript covered business dealings and political matters. But it was in the Evening Record, a smaller publication known for crime reporting and human interest stories, that David found his first lead. The headline, dated March 15, 1902, read, "Tragic fire claims 3 lives in South End mother and 2 children perish." David's pulse quickened as he read the article. A tenement fire had broken out in the early morning hours, trapping a young mother and her 2 children on the 3rd floor. The father, a railway clerk, had been working a night shift and returned to find his home destroyed and his family gone. The victims were identified as Margaret Russell, age 28, and her children Eleanor, age 6, and infant Thomas. Margaret Eleanor Russell. M.E.R. David's hands trembled slightly as he made notes. Could the locket belong to Eleanor Russell? He needed to find a photograph of the family, some way to compare the child in the studio portrait with Eleanor Russell. He searched for follow-up articles and found several. The fire had devastated the small community. The father, Harold Russell, had been inconsolable. A fund had been established to help with burial costs. The Railway Workers Association had held a memorial service. But then the trail went cold. Harold Russell seemed to disappear from public records after April 1902. No death certificate. No further mentions in any newspaper. David searched through city directories, census records, employment logs, nothing. It was as if Harold Russell had simply ceased to exist. David sat back in his chair, his mind working through possibilities. A man loses his entire family in a fire. 6 months later, a studio portrait appears showing a couple with a child wearing a locket that might bear the dead daughter's initials. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. He needed to find out more about the couple in the photograph, and he needed to discover what had happened to Harold Russell. The Whitmore studio had closed in 1928, but its records had been preserved by the Boston Photographic Historical Collection, housed in a small archive near the waterfront. David called ahead, speaking with the collection's curator, an elderly man named Thomas Brennan who had spent 40 years documenting the city's photographic heritage. "The Whitmore sitting books are incomplete," Thomas warned when David arrived that afternoon. "There was water damage in the 1950s, and some records were lost. But we have several ledgers from the early 1900s. What date are you looking for?" "Sometime in late 1902, probably September through November." Thomas led David to a wooden cabinet and carefully removed a leather-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with neat handwritten entries in faded ink. Each entry recorded the client's name, date of sitting, number of plates exposed, and payment received. They found the entry on October 12, 1902. Mr. and Mrs. Charles, Bennett with daughter, formal family portrait. 3 plates, $5 paid in full. Charles and Catherine Bennett. David copied the names carefully. "Is there an address?" he asked. Thomas pointed to a notation in the margin. 142 Commonwealth Avenue. That would have been a very prestigious address in 1902. David felt the pieces beginning to align. A wealthy couple, an address in the Back Bay, a formal portrait taken just months after a devastating fire that killed a working-class family in the South End. He needed to find out who Charles and Catherine Bennett really were, and how they came to possess a child who might be Eleanor Russell. Did Whitmore keep any personal notes, anything beyond the basic business records? David asked. Thomas hesitated. There is something. Whitmore apparently kept a private journal, separate from the business ledgers. It was more of a personal record, observations about his clients, notes about unusual sessions, that sort of thing. It's quite fragmented, but double quotes. He retrieved another volume, smaller and more worn. We don't let many researchers see this. Privacy concerns, you understand. David nodded solemnly. This is important. I think this photograph may document something significant. Thomas studied David's face for a long moment, then opened the journal to October 1902. The entries were sparse. written in a more casual hand than the business ledgers. Most were mundane observations about lighting or equipment. But there, dated October 13th, the day after the Bennett sitting, was a longer entry. David read Whitmore's words carefully, his heart pounding. Yesterday's sitting troubles me still. The couple who gave their name as Bennett arrived precisely at 2 o'clock as scheduled. The gentleman was well dressed, proper in every manner, though he seemed nervous, constantly checking his pocket watch, adjusting his collar. The lady was composed but distant, speaking little. It was the child who most concerned me. She could not have been more than 6 years old, a pretty thing with dark curls, but she said not a single word throughout the entire session. When I attempted to engage her, asking her name, her favorite toy, anything to provoke a natural expression, she simply stared. The lady Mrs. Bennett, she called herself, quickly interjected, explaining that the child was shy, unaccustomed to strangers, but it was not shyness I observed. It was fear. The gentleman positioned the child between them with a firm hand, almost proprietarily. I noticed the lady adjust something at the child's neck, a locket, gold, catching the light. When she touched it, the child flinched, barely perceptible. But I saw it. I have photographed hundreds of families. I know the difference between a child uncomfortable with the camera and a child uncomfortable with her circumstances. This was the latter. I said nothing. It is not my place to question my client's private affairs. But as they departed, the child turned back to look at me, and in that moment I saw something in her eyes, a plea perhaps, or simply resignation. I do not know. I developed the plates this morning. The portrait is technically perfect sharp focus, good composition, proper exposure. But when I look at it, I see only questions. Who are these people? And why did that child seem so very sad? David read the passage 3 times. Whitmore had sensed something wrong, something deeply wrong, but had not acted on it. Perhaps he had dismissed his concerns, convinced himself he was imagining things. Or perhaps, like many in 1902, he had believed that family matters were private, not to be interfered with. This is remarkable, Thomas said quietly. In all my years with these records, I've never seen Whitmore express such personal concern about a client. David photographed the journal page, making sure every word was captured clearly. Then he returned to the ledger, searching for any other entries related to the Bennetts. There were none. They had come once, had their portrait taken, and never returned. What about the address? David asked. 142 Commonwealth Avenue. Can we find out who lived there in 1902? Thomas led him to another set of records, property registers, and city directories. The research took an hour, but eventually they found it. 142 Commonwealth Avenue had been owned by Charles Bennett, listed as a textile merchant, and his wife Catherine. They had lived there from 1898 to 1904, when the property was sold. Do we know what happened to them after 1904? David asked. Let me check the later directories. Thomas pulled volumes from 1905, 1906, 1907. Charles Bennett appeared in the 1905 directory at a different address in Brookline, still listed as a textile merchant. But by 1906, his name had vanished entirely from Boston records. They left the city, Thomas observed. Not uncommon for wealthy families to relocate for business or personal reasons. But David was thinking about timing. The Bennetts had remained in Boston for 2 years after the portrait was taken, then left suddenly. What had happened in 1904 to prompt such a departure? He needed to find out more about Charles and Catherine Bennett, their business dealings, their social connections, their history before they appeared in that photographer's studio with a frightened child wearing a dead girl's locket. Back at his office, David expanded his search. If Eleanor Russell was indeed the child in the photograph, and if Charles and Catherine Bennett had somehow acquired her after the fire, there had to be a connection. He started with Harold Russell, the father who had lost his family and then disappeared from records. The Railway Workers Association had mentioned Russell worked as a clerk. David contacted the Boston and Albany Railroad archives, requesting employment records from 1900 to 1903. The response came 2 days later. Harold Russell had indeed been employed as a freight clerk from 1899, until March 1902, when he had stopped reporting for work shortly after the fire. But there was an additional note in his file. Wages discontinued due to absence, final payment held pending forwarding address, never claimed. A man loses his family, and abandons his job without even collecting his final wages. The grief must have been overwhelming, David thought. But where had Russell gone? He searched hospital admission records, asylum records, even prison records, thinking Russell might have suffered a breakdown or committed some act of desperation. Nothing. It was as if Harold Russell had simply walked out of his life and vanished. Then David had another thought. He returned to Charles Bennett's business records. Bennett had been listed as a textile merchant, but what if his business had other connections? David requested commercial registration documents and found that Bennett's firm, Bennett and Associates, had maintained accounts with several major clients, including, he felt his breath catch, the Boston and Albany Railroad. Bennett had been supplying textiles for railway car upholstery and worker uniforms. He would have had regular contact with railway offices, including the freight department where Harold Russell worked. The connection was there. Bennett and Russell had known each other, or at least would have crossed paths through business dealings. But how did that lead to Bennett possessing Russell's daughter months after her supposed death? David sat back, constructing possibilities. The fire had claimed 3 lives, bodies identified and buried. But what if one of those identifications had been wrong? What if, in the chaos and devastation of the fire, mistakes had been made? What if Eleanor Russell had somehow survived, and someone Charles Bennett had taken her? The question was why. And the darker question, had it been rescue or abduction? David's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through county medical records, looking for any mention of Harold Russell, he stumbled across a different name, Catherine Bennett. The record was from the Brookline Psychiatric Hospital, dated November 1903. Catherine Bennett, age 34, had been admitted for treatment of severe melancholia and nervous disorder. The admission notes were brief but revealing. Patient exhibits symptoms of profound guilt and emotional distress. Speaks repeatedly of a child, claims child is not hers. Expresses desire to confess unspecified wrongdoing. Husband reports these delusions began approximately 1 year ago without apparent cause. 1 year before. November 1903 would place the onset of Catherine's symptoms around late 1902 precisely, when the studio portrait had been taken. David requested the full medical file. It took a week to arrive, but when it did, the contents were devastating. Catherine had remained in the hospital for 7 months, during which time she had been interviewed by several doctors. Their notes painted a picture of a woman consumed by remorse. Patient remains fixated on child she refers to as the girl. When asked to clarify, patient becomes agitated, states child does not belong to her, that husband brought child home and insisted they present her as their own. Patient claims child's mother is dead, child should be with her rightful family. When pressed for details, patient becomes incoherent, weeping uncontrollably. Another entry, dated January 1904, patient's husband visited today. He was dismissive of patient's statements, claimed she had suffered a miscarriage 2 years ago, and had become obsessed with the idea of adopting a child. States there is no truth to patient's claims about a child in their home. He appeared anxious to remove patient from hospital care, stating he had arranged for private treatment at a facility in New York. Catherine Bennett had been transferred to a private sanatorium in upstate New York in March. 1904. The trail ended there, no further records, no indication of what happened to her afterward. But her testimony, dismissed as delusion by doctors and her husband, aligned perfectly with David's theory. Charles Bennett had brought a child home, insisted they raise her as their own. And when Catherine's conscience could no longer bear the deception, she had broken down completely. David now had enough evidence to form a narrative. Charles Bennett, through his business dealings with the railway, had somehow learned about the Russell family fire. Perhaps he had even been present in some capacity, offering assistance. And somehow, in the chaos, he had taken Eleanor Russell, either claiming to rescue her or simply taking advantage of confusion, to acquire the child he and his wife desperately wanted. But David still needed proof. He needed to find Eleanor herself, or at least trace what happened to her after 1904. The next lead came from an unlikely source. David had posted a query on a genealogy forum asking if anyone had information about the Bennett family of Boston. 3 days later, he received a response from a woman named Patricia Hughes in Connecticut. My grandmother attended the Worthington Academy for Girls in Western Massachusetts from 1908 to 1914. She kept a yearbook from her time there, and I remember seeing the name Bennett among her classmates. I'm not sure if it's the same family, but I can check if you'd like. David responded immediately. Providing the approximate age range, Eleanor would have been born around 1896, which would make her 12 in 1908. The right age to begin boarding school. Patricia's next message included a photograph, a scanned yearbook page from 1912 showing graduating students. Among them was Eleanor Bennett, age 16, listed as from Boston originally, residence given as New York. David's hands trembled as he enlarged the photograph. The girl in the image was older, her features matured, but there was something in her eyes, the same solemn intensity he had seen in the studio portrait. And around her neck, barely visible, was a delicate chain. He contacted the Worthington Academy immediately. The school had closed in 1956, but its records had been preserved by the local historical society. David explained his research, and the archivist agreed to search for Eleanor Bennett's files. What arrived 2 weeks later exceeded his expectations: admission records, correspondence, and most importantly, an emergency contact form. Eleanor Bennett had been enrolled in 1908 by Charles Bennett of Albany, New York, who listed himself as her guardian, not her father. The form included a notation: students' parents deceased, no other living relatives. But there was more. Tucked into Eleanor's file was a letter dated June 1914, written in a young woman's careful script, to whom it may concern. I am writing to inform the school that I will not be returning for further studies. My guardian has passed away, and I have decided to pursue independent employment. I wish to thank the faculty for their kindness during my years here. However, I must state plainly that the name I have used, Eleanor Bennett, is not my true name. My real name is Eleanor Russell. My mother was Margaret Russell, and she died in a fire in Boston in 1902. I do not know what happened in those early years, why I was taken from my father, or how I came to live as someone else, but I intend to find out. I am 18 now, and I will discover the truth about who I am and what was done to me. David immediately began searching for Eleanor Russell after 1914. The trail was difficult, a young woman traveling alone, possibly using different names in an era when records were inconsistent. But he found fragments: a boarding house registry in Springfield listing an E. Russell in 1915, an employment record from a textile factory in Lowell showing Eleanor Russell hired as a clerk in 1916. Then, in the Boston City Archives, he found what he had been searching for: a legal petition filed in 1918. Eleanor Russell, age 22, was requesting access to records related to the 1902 tenement fire that had supposedly claimed her life and the lives of her mother and infant brother. David obtained the full court file. Eleanor's petition included a sworn statement detailing what she had been able to piece together about her own history. Her account was methodical and devastating. She remembered fragments of the fire smoke, her mother screaming, being carried outside by a neighbor. She remembered being taken to a hospital, confused and frightened. And she remembered, days later, being told by a well-dressed man that her father had died of grief, that she had no family left, that he and his wife would care for her now. That man had been Charles Bennett. Eleanor's investigation, conducted over 4 years, had uncovered the truth. The fire had indeed killed her mother and infant brother. Eleanor had been rescued, but was in shock, barely able to speak. In the chaos at the hospital, with multiple victims from various tenements brought in simultaneously, record keeping had been confused. A nurse, overwhelmed and exhausted, had mistakenly recorded Eleanor as deceased along with her mother and brother. Charles Bennett, who had been at the hospital offering assistance to railway workers, families, his company had relationships with railway employees, had overheard discussions about the Russell case. He had learned that Eleanor's father, Harold Russell, believed his entire family dead and was in the grip of suicidal despair. Bennett had also learned that no other relatives had come forward to claim the surviving child. Bennett and his wife had been unable to have children. Multiple miscarriages had devastated Catherine. And there, in that hospital, was an opportunity. A child with no family, no one to claim her, no one who would ask questions if she simply disappeared into a new life. Bennett had presented himself to the hospital administrators as a concerned businessman offering to assist. He had arranged Eleanor's discharge into his care, claiming he would ensure she reached distant relatives. Instead, he had taken her home, and over the following months, he and Catherine had systematically erased Eleanor Russell and created Eleanor Bennett. The locket with her mother's initials was the only connection to her real identity that Eleanor had been allowed to keep. Perhaps Catherine had insisted on it, unable to completely erase the truth. As for Harold Russell, Eleanor's investigation had uncovered the darkest truth of all. Eleanor's court petition had included evidence David had not yet found. Harold Russell had not simply disappeared in grief. In May 1902, 2 months after the fire, Russell's body had been recovered from Boston Harbor. The death had been ruled a suicide, a devastated father who could not bear to live without his family. But the coroner's report, which Eleanor had obtained, noted something peculiar. Bruising on Russell's arms and torso inconsistent with drowning alone, suggesting a possible struggle before death. However, in 1902, with no witnesses and a clear motive for suicide, no further investigation had been pursued. Eleanor's petition argued that her father's death should be reinvestigated, that Charles Bennett's actions, taking her from the hospital under false pretenses, allowing Harold Russell to believe she was dead, had directly contributed to Russell's final despair. If Harold had known his daughter survived, Eleanor argued he would have had reason to live. The court had granted Eleanor access to all records but had declined to pursue criminal charges. Charles Bennett had died in 1930. Catherine Bennett had passed away in the New York sanatorium in 1907, never having recovered from her breakdown. There was no one left to prosecute. But Eleanor had achieved something more important than legal justice. She had reclaimed her identity. The court officially recognized her as Eleanor Russell, daughter of Harold and Margaret Russell, and granted her access to her father's unclaimed wages and small estate. David found one final record. Eleanor Russell had married in 1920, moved to Providence, Rhode Island, and lived until 1968. She had worked for decades as an advocate for orphan children, helping to establish regulations and oversight for adoption procedures to prevent tragedies like her own. When David finally compiled his research into a presentation for the Historical Society, the studio portrait took on its full meaning. It was not a family portrait at all. It was evidence of an abduction, a document of a crime committed in plain sight, preserved by a photographer who had sensed something wrong but had not known what to do. Emma enhanced the image one final time, bringing every detail into sharp focus. The locket with Margaret Russell's initials, the tension in Eleanor's small frame, the guilt already visible in Catherine Bennett's rigid posture, the calculation in Charles Bennett's protective hand on the child's shoulder. This photograph, David said at the presentation, is a testament to resilience. Eleanor Russell spent her childhood as someone else, but she never stopped being herself. And when she was old enough, she fought to reclaim her identity and ensure that other children would be protected from similar fates. The image that had seemed so ordinary, a wealthy couple with their daughter in a Boston studio, had revealed a story of loss, deception, and ultimately, determination. Eleanor Russell had been stolen, renamed, and nearly erased from history. But she had survived. She had remembered. And she had made certain that her truth would not be forgotten. The photograph remained on display at the Historical Society, with a full placard explaining Eleanor's story. Visitors would stop, study the image, and see what the photographer had seen in 1902. A child who did not belong, a family that was not a family, and a moment of profound injustice captured forever in silver and light.